novel launch of Bradley Tusk's Obvious in Hindsight. My name is Jackie Zupsik. I run the LA office of Tusk Strategies, which is a regulatory consulting arm of one of the many Tusk Holdings companies that Bradley has started. So I worked with Bradley now for 7 years. And as part of that, I find that giving this introduction for him is always really hard because he always has something new going on. So the list of accomplishments keeps growing and growing and growing. But the thing that he's most well known for those of you that don't know him, he ran Mike Bloomberg's campaign for mayor of New York City, which is probably the most notable, and then went on to represent many different tech companies as they are fighting against entrenched industries. So Uber, Lemonade, Bird, and many, many more. So Bradley is a venture capitalist, a philanthropist, a political consultant, and now an author.
And a father.
And a father. Great.
My kids will appreciate that. Yeah.
On top of it, he's got a podcast. He's got a bookstore. I mean, the list goes on and on.
If you're ever looking to lose a lot of money, open a bookstore.
And he's joined today by the fabulous Julia Walsh from Politico, California. So Julia has moved out to California too, and she'll tell you a little more about this to expand the footprint of Politico. But these two go back to New York, where they've worked together for quite some time. Julia also worked at Politico doing politics and power, which I think is the coolest combination of things to get to cover on Earth, for Politico New York, and before that for the New York Post. So I'll let the reporter do the interviewing.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out, everyone. I think I'd like to start at the beginning. Okay. Yeah. When did you get the idea for this book?
So I wrote a memoir a couple of years ago called The Fixer. And then, do you know how celebrities like to buy liquor companies? It's like a thing, right? So Steven Soderbergh, the movie director, bought a Bolivian brandy company. And I think what Steven didn't realize is between importation, alcohol, and Bolivia is like a communist country that we don't really have diplomatic ties with. There's a lot of regulatory stuff, and he needed a federal rule change to be able to import his product. And I got introduced to him and started working with him on and we got the rule change done. And when the Fixer came out, my first book, I gave him, I'd just be curious your opinion on it. And he said, I'm flying to London tonight. I'll read it. I'll send you a note. I wake up the next day and it's, let's make this a TV show. So I started thinking okay, what would be fun? It was clear that it should be about a campaign to do something. And I wanted something that was a little bit out there and a little futuristic. Ironically, the flying car industry has made a tremendous amount of progress from when I started working on this to now. So it went from totally fantastical to kind of almost happening. And so we wrote the pilot together, and then I wrote 9 more scripts, and we were all ready to go. And our big meeting was supposed to be out here with wherever Apple TV is, March 10th, 2020. That obviously did not happen. But I kind of really liked the story, and I felt like he was kind of moving on to other stuff. So let me see if I can turn it to a novel. Not easy. It took me a couple of years to figure out how to write a novel, but and that's eventually what led to this.
So I guess the next thing I'll ask you about is, actually what I'd like you to do is, this is not a reading, but I do want you to read a small section because I love the character that you introduce here, Pinky Finesca.
So without revealing who it is, we had a pre-call the other day, and the person in real life that it's based on, she figured it out in 30 seconds. It's 8:30 p.m. and Lisa's still at the office, sitting in a windowless room with Pinky Fonseca, Firewall's chief opposition researcher. Everyone else at Firewall works in the bullpen, open plan style, but they keep Pinky away from the group and away from the clients. Lisa tries to avoid Pinky's office as much as possible. She has always hated collections of things: stamps, coins, baseball cards, Appalachian pottery. To her, it feels like pointless clutter. Pinky lives for them. In his tiny, formerly storage room office, he keeps the 7th largest private holding of butterflies in the mid-Atlantic, set behind glass frames that cover all 4 walls, plus a widely coveted set of Bundini Brown memorabilia and his 3 favorite antique prosthetic limbs from the much larger stockpile that he keeps in a storage unit under the FDR.
Give you a sense of how weird people in politics are.
And by the way, so for those of you who don't have a political background, The Oppo people are the weirdest by far always, because like they literally spend their life digging through like records and trash and whatever else. So you really do keep them away from the clients.
But they're also among the most powerful, right? Like they, dig up stuff on candidates that completely sink their campaigns. Yep. And so I just thought that was a brilliant character. And what was the research like for this? I mean, I know a lot of this is based on your own experience, right. but what did you do to inform that?
So flying cars, so in real life, the industry is called eVTOL, so it's electronic vertical takeoff and landing. That's a real industry, right? And so I haven't, out of my fund, invested in it, I think in part because it's very, very capital intensive. And so just based on the size of the checks that we write, the math doesn't really make sense for us to be in it. So it was sort of meeting with the eVTOL founders and people in the sector and really kind of understanding how that works, knowing that it was a novel and I didn't have to sort of be exactly right. But then also was like a lot of learning little things, like my friend Rick Jacobs, who's here, like I would have like LA City Hall questions and I would like email him like, so if I wanted to stay at the mayor's office, like what's the slang for that? Like the third floor. I'm like, cool, thank you. And like, it was like questions like that all the time. For New York, I didn't really need anyone to kind of guide me through it. But for Austin, my friend Louis Science kind of did the same thing for me. And so, with some political people in different places, some tech people, and then just making up a lot of shit. Yeah.
Making up a lot of shit, but very prescient shit, because this novel closed about a year ago. Mm-hmm. And the New York City mayor character Navarro is being circled by the FBI, which is actually happening right now. And there's a bit at the end about legalizing psychedelics. Yep. Which of course is maybe happening in Sacramento next session. So tell me a little bit about like how much of this is real and how much of it is. Oh, there's also a New York Post Metro investigative reporter named Julia. My name is Julia. I was the New York City Hall bureau chief for the New York Post. I'm assured it's a composite.
Yep.
But Nick,
you're much nicer than
there's also, you joke that one of the main characters who's based in part on you does go to prison. So
yeah, my mom was not happy about that. She's like, why does the one character based on you have to go to jail? And I'm like, there's a little bit of me in all the characters. So
maybe you could talk about, we were talking about Navarro, the New York City mayor character, and how he initially was based on de Blasio. He'd never had a job, not working in politics. So he's like, how am I going to make money when I leave City Hall? But then you said he kind of took on a life of his own.
Yeah, I mean, that's all of the characters were initially based on somebody in my head. And then between the course of writing it as scripts and then turning it into a novel, they kind of became their own people in a weird way. So like Navarro was very much meant to be de Blasio. As you may remember from New York, I was a pretty vocal public critic of de Blasio.
I quoted you in the New York Post about that all the time.
Yeah, the most vocal critic probably of de Blasio. But I had spent 4 years in Chicago. I was the deputy governor of Illinois, and Rich Daley was the mayor at the time. And, sometimes we worked together, sometimes we fought. But I got to know him. And in my head, in some ways, Navarro was too intelligent to remain Bill de Blasio. So he became Rich Daley in my head. So when I write Navarro's dialogue, I hear Rich speaking. And it's only kind of a coincidence, because we tried to warn the public desperately during the 2021 mayoral campaign that Eric Adams is a criminal. But it wasn't meant that this current mayor of New York City would be under FBI investigation the exact week that the book came out. And yet last week, the FBI stopped him on the street and seized his electronic devices. And so we'll see where that all goes. But yeah, life and art are really colliding quite a bit.
In terms of that, with the flying cars, we were talking about this interesting dynamic where you could actually have federal regulatory approval for flying cars ahead of autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
Explain why you think that is.
Yeah. So my venture fund's a little weird in that we're a lot like every early stage venture fund, that we're looking at how big is the market and how good is the founder and whatever else. But then we ask two more questions. One, is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved can really drive growth and valuation? And if so, can we solve it? And when the answer is yes to both, that's when it makes sense for us to invest. So like we invested in FanDuel, legalized fantasy sports betting everywhere. Invested in Roman, legalized prescription via text, and so on. In fact, Evan Vandenberg, who's I can quickly tell your story, which is so Dibs, which is a physical and digital kind of custodial product at this point. Initially kind of more based on the NFT world, but has evolved outside of that. And I've never met a founder who did this before. He's like, well, should we be regulated? And I was like, no one's ever asked me that before. And we undertook this research project together of like, okay, what should we or shouldn't we, and who should it be? And we ended up deciding between the state of Wyoming, the state of New York, and the SEC. Picked the state of New York, and then went to them and said, we'd like to be regulated. And they were like, what? Like no one's ever said that to them either. And it's been a long process, but we're just about there. And thank God. And so we'll invest in companies, when we think that we can make a material difference in their ultimate success or failure. What was the actual question I was answering? I don't remember.
Why politically you think that politically regulatory, well, of course, we all know one informs the other, but why could we get federal FAA approval of flying cars ahead of DOT approval of autonomous vehicles?
So like half of our work is, like Uber was the first thing I ever did kind of in the tech world. And like as much as Travis likes to say that like he invented the idea of people paying you from get to point A to point B, like that's been going on for thousands of years. He came up with a much better way to do it. And so in those kinds of campaigns, like FanDuel is a good example of that, or Lemonade, it's really a fight between new competitors and entrenched interests over market share that takes place through the guise of regulation, right? The entrenched interests don't want the competition, and they use their political muscle to try to prevent it, and then we come in and fight back and try to overcome it. So autonomous vehicles fits into that bucket to a certain extent because there are the existing auto manufacturers, and we're invested in a company north from the state called Kodiak, which is an autonomous trucking company. And the Teamsters very much see themselves as they see autonomous trucking as an existential threat to their business, which I actually don't agree with. But either way, Trump saw himself as a Teamsters guy. Biden sees himself as a Teamsters guy. And as a result, the regulation that's been needed out of Washington now has been languishing for over 7 years because the Teamsters have been blocking it. Ironically, because flying cars don't exist, there's no one to disrupt, right? And so the FAA, while they're very much a stickler on safety and all of that, there hasn't been someone saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And so they've kind of slowly but incrementally kept making progress, whereas autonomous vehicles, it's just, we hit a wall, right? So we can operate intrastate. So we operate in California, for example. We have a huge contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. So like even the federal government we can deal with, but we can't have a Kodiak truck cross from California into Nevada or Oregon or Utah or whatever the neighboring state might be. So that presence of that sort of entrenched interest really has a huge determination on whether or not a technology can move forward. So even though anyone would have bet 5, 6, 7 years ago that autonomous vehicles would roll out a decade before flying cars, it turns out now they're neck and neck.
There's a line in here. I'd just like to read it real quick. Lisa, who's taken over this political consulting firm after Nick goes to jail, is explaining why her firm would still have business if the founder, just went off to prison. And she says, for as long as we have a fucked up democracy, we'll have customers.
Yes.
Bradley, do we have a fucked up democracy?
We have a very fucked up democracy.
Tell me more.
So at the very end of the book, there's something called the 10 Rules of Demystify Politics. And I wrote this a couple of years ago because I found myself constantly explaining it. And I was like, why don't I put it on paper, and I published it. And so I worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch. I've run campaigns. Like I've seen this, I believe, from multiple parts of the country from every angle. And the takeaway I have from all of it is every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And if they believe that doing what you want can help them win their next election, they'll work with you. If they believe that not doing what you want could cost them their next election, they'll work with you. And if you can't convince them of either one, you have no shot whatsoever. And so that is what actually inspires all of the sort of decision making that happens over the course of the book by each of the characters. But it then leads to this broader question of, well, why are things the way they are? So we live in a world where, because of gerrymandering, almost every district and every election is really the primary is the only election that matters. And putting presidential primaries aside, turnouts typically 10 to 15%. So who is that? The furthest left, the furthest right, or a bunch of special interests? Hey, Solomon. I think I know almost everybody here. That explains why we have either one of two things. We have this wild dysfunction in DC, right? Because they don't get anything done. Or we have really one-sided government, whether it's the city of San Francisco on the left or the state of Texas on the right. But the good news is, because politicians generally believe in nothing other than their own ambition, they'll do whatever they do to stay in office. So take assault weapons. You're a Republican congressman from Florida, turnout in your district primary is 12%, NRA members are half that 12%. You know that it's crazy that someone can walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47, but you also know that should you ever say that, you're done. So there was a congressman in upstate New York named Chris Jacobs, who was like a Trumper. Like, we're not talking about anyone who's really far right, but there was a mass shooting, you might remember, at a supermarket in Buffalo. A lot of people died, and he was shaken up by it and said, maybe we ought to look at these laws. So this was September. He was up for re-election that November. They stripped the line from him. He wasn't even allowed to run. Like, his career literally ended that day. And so, but imagine in Jacob's primary, if turnout were 36% instead of 12, then all of a sudden the NRA goes from half the vote share to a sixth of the vote share. And then if you just look at the polling of your average Republican on how they feel about like certain assault weapons, they would say, no, we do want some level of sensible laws around this. And so you would have to flip your position because you want to stay in office, right? And so it's all a long way of saying that the only solution, unless we got rid of gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court has made it clear that we're not going to, is to radically increase primary turnout. When I ran the campaigns to legalize Uber around the country, the way that we want, I know now Uber's like the big bad Uber, but we were like a tiny little Series A company. I mean, my conference room for a while was the New York office. And taxi was a very muscular industry, but we were able to, through the app, mobilize millions of our customers to email, tweet, text, in some way tell their elected officials, I want this thing. And we changed the inputs as a result. And I remember thinking at the time, like, none of these people know who their state senator is. None of these people vote in city council primaries, but we gave them something to care about and we made it really easy and they did it. What if we could vote like this? And so I started the Mobile Voting Project a couple of years ago. And we have been funding elections in different jurisdictions around the country. So 7 states, 21 jurisdictions, where either deployed military or people with disabilities have voted in real elections on their phone. Turnout on average has doubled. National Cybersecurity Center's audited all of them. They've come back clean. The cybersecurity community gave me tons of shit about it, though, that it wasn't safe. So we built our own mobile voting tech. So 3 years and $10 million later, we are going to release it in Q1. It's going to be open source and free to anybody that wants to use it, build on it, anything else. And to me, the reason that I'm doing all of this is the only scalable solution to democracy. If we can get primary turnout to be meaningfully higher, things move towards the middle, things can get done. But for as long as the only people participating in the system are people who want moral purity at all costs, then the politicians are just going to follow those incentives and inputs. And so we do have a fucked up democracy, but I also think that we might have a solution to it. So now it's going to be really hard to make it happen because, ironically, we're going to unite the two parties plus every lobbyist, every union, every trade group against us, because if you know how to win power in a low turnout primary system, you don't want to make it easier to lose it. So like, I used to be Chuck Schumer's communications director in the Senate. If I went to Chuck and said, Chuck, here are 25 issues you purport to believe, and they don't actually believe anything, but let's pretend to. These would all be more likely to become law if we had mobile voting. His only answer to me would be like, I'm not making it easier for AOC to primary me. And that would be it. And it would be dead right there and then. So we're going to have to build a movement, right? And it's going to really require, I have a book coming out next September, which is nonfiction about mobile voting. It's almost an open letter to Gen Z and Gen Alpha saying, like, the country's super fucked up. Your future is fucked up. There is a solution. Here's what it is. And we're going to need a movement, right? So we're working now with like David Hogg and people from the Parkland movement and everything else. And hopefully we will be able to sort of overcome the entire status quo, but it's going to be hard.
Yeah. We'll see you back here next year on that, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. That one's probably not quite the page turner of this one.
There's another line in here that I want to read, and we touched on some of this, but maybe you could. Let me just check our time here too. I've got some time. You say that the tech community uses politics to legalize its products. And this book is about that, and about how the tech community also sometimes misunderstands politics and watches their startups go broke as a result. Yeah. I'd asked you for an example of each of those scenarios in real life.
Yeah. So in terms of understanding, I think I gave it already, which is in Uber in the sense of we figured out that we could change the underlying inputs, and we did. And FanDuel with the same thing. Bird, we did it again. Ease, when we ran the campaigns here in California to legalize weed delivery. So if you like that, you're welcome. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. But either way, in mobilizing people. But there was an LA startup called My Table, and the concept was interesting. So it was kitchen sharing. So like ride sharing or home sharing, it was like you live alone, you made a big thing of lasagna, you can only get eat a square of it, you put the rest on a marketplace and people can buy it. It kind of breeds some community and whatever else. And it was a cool idea, but it was a very early stage company. And we have a very established food and restaurant inspection system in this country for very good reason, right? We can all basically walk into any place. The food might be bad, but we're pretty sure we're not going to get sick from it, right? That's because we have a very thorough food inspection, restaurant inspection system. My Table would have required a reimagining of the entire thing. And I was sort of really intrigued by it because I was like, oh, we could live stream all the preparation and buy all the ingredients from a central location. I had all these ideas in my head as to how it could be done. And maybe in theory that could have worked, but over a many year period and they had funding for like a year, right? And they ran out of money long before I figured out how to solve their problem. And that was the end of it. In fact, that industry's never gotten off the ground. And so I think understanding the regulatory climate, and oftentimes when we don't invest in companies, it's because I don't think that the problem is winnable from a political standpoint. I think that the lift is too heavy, especially if it requires federal action, right? So we live in a world now where an act of Congress is literally synonymous with a miracle. I can't base investment strategy on a miracle, right? So if we can get stuff done at a state or local level, it's then usually at least it's in the mix of feasibility because there's 50 states, there's hundreds of cities, you can play them against each other. But when it's just Washington, it's as hopeless as it seems.
I'll mention later, but that's why Politico is expanding in California because things actually get done here. In this book, when people are skeptical that flying cars could be real, Theranos is invoked a number of times. Is there a Theranos effect happening today in terms of tech? Yeah,
there's a few things. So one is there was this sort of golden age of tech where like we could do no wrong, right? And it didn't matter what startup I was invested in or working with. You go to reporters, but wow, innovation, this is so great. And then reality kicks in, which are startup founders are people, and some of them are really good, and some of them are not good, like Sam Bankman-Fried, like Elizabeth Holmes. And then, you guys in the media tend to sort of latch onto an all or nothing narrative, usually on either end. So it went from this is so wonderful to this is so evil. And so I think, Theranos did a few things. One is, look, anytime that we saw like any sort of blood related startup for a while, like we were like, no, which is ridiculous because there's a lot of things that can be done to help people in that space. It's kind of recovered finally, but it really deterred progress for a couple of years in that specific sector. But beyond that, generally speaking, the kind of attitudes from regulators and everyone else kind of went from, okay, we need to work with these companies to, oh, the reporters that cover my boss or me or whatever else, now all because the proper liberal position is to hate tech and hate business, we can be anti-tech and anti-business. And like, look, they never should have been. We were never as good as they said we were in the old days, and we're not nearly as bad as they say we are now. Everything is mixed because it's reality. But yeah, I would say Theranos and then, again, SBF just kind of didn't help because he perpetuated it. Yeah, those are things that, they're only one example. Or take Cruz in San Francisco, right? Where it sounds like they were right to suspend it based on what happened. But at the same time, someone dies in a car accident in this country every 15 minutes, right? I think it's like 26,000 people a year die in car accidents in this country. And like no one, because it's so routine, it doesn't get coverage, it doesn't get attention, it gets ignored. The only way you're going to fix that is to have autonomous vehicles where like ultimately machines are just going to be better drivers than human beings. But we got to get from point A to point B. And because cruise is both really exciting and cool and also scary, one or two problems sort of puts the whole thing on ice. And so I think, and look, it's easy for me to say because I make more money when the companies get out there and succeed. But I think we've got to sometimes look a little to the future and say, if we want these types of changes, societal outcomes to happen, we have to go through some amount of experimentation and pain and everything else to get there.
I think my last question, and then I'll turn it over to you all. There's another kind of funny, being someone who used to work in New York media and now in California media, there's a funny part in the beginning here about Nick decides to hold the press conference about this flying car startup in LA instead of New York. Because he hopes to soften the sharpness of the questions by maybe 10%.
So you tell me.
And he said, in Los Angeles, moods are tempered by incessant sunshine, and the market is spread out enough that reporters aren't constantly at each other's throats.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
Or no? It is. All right. Is 10% too low? Should it have been higher?
Yes.
I was trying to be nice to the California political reporters. And look, New York it's a blood sport, right?
It really is.
It is, and it's fun, and like we can sit, you and I could just for an hour just gossip about all these different things, and it's really fun. But at the same time, it can also be destructive, right? Because everyone is so intent on sort of thinking about, what Route 9 is going to do, and how do you preempt it, and how do that a lot of effort that should go into like governing and things like that instead gets spent sort of like thinking about the mindset of the New York City political press corps. So it's nice to see that, here in LA, maybe they have a little more freedom to actually govern.
Do they have more humanity? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think they have better things to do. I mean, look, so
they'd rather go to the beach and.
But look, so as a New Yorker, and there's some former New Yorkers in this room that I know, I'm supposed to not like Los Angeles, right? I fucking love Los Angeles.
Oh, I love it too.
Yeah. Like as soon as my kids are out of the house, like I'm spending the winters here. Like, why would I want to be in Manhattan in February? It's miserable.
Awful.
And so, I think there's a lot to. I remember when Jackie wanted to open up an LA office, I was like, yeah, we should definitely have that. And so, so I think, but it's definitely a different. But it's funny. I had lunch with a LA Times political reporter yesterday, and every political subculture is unique and fascinating, right? And whether it's New York politics or California politics or Texas politics or Illinois politics, like they're all similar in enough ways that the underlying human nature of everyone in the system is kind of the same, but the individual issues and personalities and everything is different, and the structure is a little different, and that makes it really fun.
Cool. Any questions from the audience?
How did you, or in what ways did you rethink the narrative or the characters when you went from thinking that as a screen thing to a novel?
Yeah, a few things. So one is when it was, and Brian Buckley, who is working with me again on turning this into a TV show, can speak to this pretty well, because now we're back in the process of adapting it back into scripts again. One is, I would say, I wrote it pre-COVID, and I'm amazed at how many references there were that no longer make any sense, and then I had to take them out in the book. But I think, in a weird way, a TV show maybe had more room. I kind of made it tighter and narrower in the novel. Like I had more storylines in the TV show, more subplots, and I think maybe it was too complicated. And in fact, one of the kind of debates that we have a meeting about this tomorrow that we have is, I'm now a little wedded to what I wrote in the novel. And Brian's like, no, now we got to go back. This was actually the right thing to do when you had it in episode 6. And so we're sort of fighting that out a little bit right now. But I found that, like, just generally speaking, structuring a novel was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, right? Like my first book was a memoir, which was super, like, then I did this, then I did that. And like when I didn't remember something, I just Googled like, what happened in the Uber DC fight? And then like, oh yeah, right. And the voting book was, not as easy to write because it's a really substantive book. But again, like it was on, I wasn't making anything up, right? So it was like, okay, this chapter is going to be about the various types of political reforms in America and where we stack up to those. And like, it was a kind of a definable universe. And in fiction, it can be anything, which is both awesome and terrifying, right? And so for me, like coming up with the plot, the characters, the storylines, like that wasn't really that hard. How to structure it and shape it all into sort of a narrative that actually works for a reader, that was really hard.
Anybody else?
What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for mobile voting? Because it sounds like you've
A
got
lot.
like a little niche
Yeah.
with that military and others.
Yeah.
What's your...
A few. So there's our stated opponents, right? So that is there's a whole world of paper ballot advocates, and they think that only election should be on paper. And I don't quite get this because I recall in the year 2000 hanging chads resulting in the election of a president that then started a war that killed 1 million people for no reason whatsoever. So I'm not sure the paper ballots are so great. But we've got to fight through all of those, and they're very aligned with like the left, and so somehow now we're insufficiently woke as a result. And then the cybersecurity community, we were talking about this the other day. Just like human nature, there are cybersecurity professors at MIT who they know that if Julia calls them and they want to be in the story, she's looking for the quote expressing concern about my mobile voting system, right? And they want to be in the story because that makes them feel relevant. And so therefore they feel compelled to be opposed to it. So there's sort of a cottage industry of people in that community. So when we launched the tech next year, I don't know if you guys remember like the Pepsi challenge from the 80s, but I've kind of got to do that with voting machines and paper ballots, because if you judge us in a vacuum, like, of course we're not perfect. Like, of course that if Russia put all of its resources into hacking something, yeah, they probably could do it, but like, I can't solve for that standard. It's, can my system be at least as secure as every other way of voting? And if you can do that and be far more accessible, it's inherently better. So it's overcoming all of that. And then with the politicians, it's tricky because they can't say we don't want more people to vote, right? So when you look at, like, for example, the voting restrictions in Texas or Georgia, like no one actually said we don't want Black people to vote. That's why they did it. That's what they meant. That's why they wanted them to have to come to a polling place. They could come up with an excuse to send them away. In fact, at South by Southwest this year, I did a panel with Martin Luther King III on mobile voting, and the reason he's supporting it is, in his mind, it's the best anti-voter suppression tool possible. Because if you're just doing this, and 96% of American adults have a cell phone now, you can't discriminate based on race. So they're going to use words like integrity and security and all of this stuff. And if I can't overcome this initial line of resistance from the paper ballot advocates and the cybersecurity professors who want to be quoted in Politico, then they'll have a great excuse to never do it. So if we can surmount the first one, then we can kind of force the narrative on, in my view, for them to have to be more honest about why they don't want it, which is they don't want to risk losing power. People are not sympathetic to that. But based on the polling that I've done around mobile voting, basically everyone likes the idea of it, provided that it's secure, right? And so establishing that is going to be the key to this whole thing.
Mel?
So political nonfiction books, infamously, the cliche in Washington is everyone goes to the index to find their names to see where they're mentioned.
Yeah.
So in a fictional book,
yeah,
Julia aside,
yeah,
how would you sort of assess people's ability to recognize themselves?
So I would say a few things. So one is the specific person whom Pinky Fonseca, when I read that little part about, so I kind of tried to preempt about 6 months ago. I gave him a copy and I said, hey, it's based on real people, including you, but I had to make them super weird to make the book interesting. And because the character that people presume to be me, it gets in the most trouble by far. It gives me a little bit of cover. Now, in reality, it was not that far. You guessed who it was, like 10 seconds.
I asked Sally Goldenberg too, and she immediately guessed.
Yeah. It was not particularly exaggerated at all. So there was some of that. There's some of like a kind of a guessing game, like The Information wrote a piece and they were kind of played some guessing game on Twitter, and that was kind of fun, right? And then sometimes, when people see themselves in like someone tells me, well, was Lisa partly me? I'm like, did you like Lisa? They're like, yeah. I'm like, yes, definitely. So, or I deny it, depending
But it is very much like a satire, and there's like a psilocybin lip balm, and the Audubon Society goes on an annual ayahuasca retreat, and there's just like some very funny
And look,
riffing on the.
I had so much to work with because politics is ridiculous and tech is ridiculous, and so being able to sort of satirize either of them or combine the two, there was a lot to work with. Cool. Anybody else?
As somebody who works for you, I see how fast you reply email, and so it feels like you're always like available. I'm curious, just like when and how you found time to write a book.
Oh yeah, that's mainly just because I'm like really ADD and I just kind of have to. But whenever I could, right? So like I found that when I needed to sort of think about what I was going to write, I would have to set aside like a weekend day or evening, or I get up really early, so early morning. But if it was just like, okay, I need to write some dialogue to advance the plot from point A to point B, I had like half an hour in between meetings, whatever. In fact, the reason why, so, I came out of the Bloomberg world, and so did Bob Lawson here, and we all sat in the bullpen. Mike still does. And the reason that I eventually, you weren't even working for us yet, but moved into an office was because I wanted to have a place where, okay, if I'm going to write this, and multiple books and whatever else, I need to have those half an hour where I can close the door and nobody bothers me so that I can write. So that's why actually I don't sit with everybody else anymore. But what I've learned is I am happier as a human being when I have a writing project, right? And it can be fiction, it could be nonfiction, it could be a TV show. But it just, and hopefully it succeeds. But even if it doesn't, it just, the act of writing makes me happy. And I think if you love to write, and I imagine it's like my daughter's a really talented painter and drawer. I see the same thing with her. If there's an art that you love to make, almost no matter how good or bad you are at it, making it makes you happy, then you find time to do it and you make it work. And if you think you have this great novel in you, but you kind of can't get yourself to sit down and write, the answer may be like, you have a cool idea, but you don't like it enough to sacrifice, watching, Netflix or whatever else it is, to be able to do it. So it's one of those weird things where like, if you're truly passionate about it, you find the time. And if you can't find the time, you should probably examine whether the conception you have about yourself and the reality are the same thing.
Anybody else?
Yes. We could plug Political California.
Yeah, I'm going to do that if there are no more questions. Well, first I'm going to say buy a book. I read it over a weekend. It's like a great, funny page turner. And if New York City, LA, Austin politics, you really recognize little quirky things about it. And then also, of course, some of the satire is really fun as well. Next to the book is a free Politico playbook notebook. If you like reading about politics, it's a daily newsletter free to your inbox every morning. It's kind of the political Bible for the state. And as I mentioned, we're expanding in California because we see a real opportunity, a real vacuum in political coverage. And specifically, we hired Melanie Mason from the LA Times recently. She anchors our LA political coverage. Sasha Eisenberg, we hired to lead our dedicated ballot initiative coverage because that's such a huge issue in California. We're going to be hiring more reporters in LA, and also welcome anybody's ideas for this political news that you're just not getting. Would love to hear from you.
And you figured out a business model in media that actually makes money.
Yes,
right?
we actually make money. We're not laying people off.
Yeah,
the Washington Post is losing $100 million next year, run by the richest man in the world. So we have figured it out where he is not. So that is pretty exciting.
And I would say this even if I wasn't sitting next to you, as a Political Pro subscriber, it's a very good product.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and we're covering all the twists and turns in the autonomous vehicle fight with labor and the legalization of psychedelics and how that was affected by the plane crash with the pilot who said he was on mushrooms for 2 days. But it's all really fun and entertaining, but also important to our lives and our democracy.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bradley.
Let's go.
Hey guys. Thank you. Thanks. That was really fun. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, as far as that's known, I had lunch with Ben at Rescues yesterday. He
Oh
was
yeah.
lamenting that you guys
That we
stole
took
her.
her.
Yeah.